Well, what a great primer to think and pray on small groups. This morning, I want to let you know we're continuing our series of studying Ordinary Women, Extraordinary God this morning. And our speaker today is one of the elders here at GBC, Jason Wallace. He and his family have attended GBC for about 13 years, and we're excited to hear what the Lord has laid on Jason's heart. So Jason, if you would come and share with us.
Good morning, everybody. So, first of all, I want to thank Kim for that amazing testimony this morning. I also want to let you know that this morning was the first time I'd heard that. I had no idea she was going to speak this morning or what she was going to speak about. And I also didn't know until yesterday that Mark had made that video about small groups. So all three of us have been working on these things for quite a while, and they've all kind of come together. And what's amazing to me, amazing about God, is that we really tied together what we're talking about this morning. All these themes are very consistent. So God is amazing, and I'm just so thankful for Him. So we'll get into it. There is a game that you might have played at some point in time in your life, and it goes like this: if your life was to be made into a movie, which actor or actress would you get to play you? Anybody ever played that game before? It's generally a superficial game, mostly based on who we look like, but it also could be shared character traits like being funny or intellectual, or maybe just plain goofy. One of my favorites. Well, there's a biblical version of this game as well, only it's played quite a bit differently. It goes like this. There are a great many people in this book. And if you could go back in time and insert yourself into any one of the events described here, which person would you most closely identify with? Okay? Basically, you have to take what you know about yourself and match it up with what you know about biblical people. Just as a couple of examples, how about Peter? Here's a faithful, hyper-focused believer who was on fire for Jesus. But at the same time, he was also stubborn, insecure, and at times a shameful coward. Or how about Miriam? She was Moses' sister-in-law, and God used her in powerful ways. She was a powerful prophetess. But at the same time, she experienced extreme jealousy and resentment when she came across other believers who were also used powerfully by God. So this game, it's not at all about hairlines and eye color. Instead, it's introspective. You have to look at positive character traits, but also at the serious character flaws that these folks had as well. So you have to be pretty honest with yourself when matching up. It can be a very convicting game that can make you ask and face some tough questions. The reason I mention this game is because when I first read this passage for this morning, it blew me away how closely I identified with one of the people in this story, Martha. Now, some guys might be a little awkward getting up in front of a couple hundred people and saying that they identified very, very closely with a woman. But for me, I'm not too worried about that. Quite a few of my friends actually call me Mantha because I have a passion for interior decorating. Most of my friends also know that I cried during almost every episode of Downton Abbey, and that my favorite character is Miss Patmore. So my friends already look at me funny. So with that, let's open up in prayer. Father, be with us today, and please let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. So let's continue with the game for a moment. How do I relate to Martha? Well, anybody who's ever been to our house knows that if we have company over, I make a beeline for the kitchen. right? It's where I'm comfortable, it's where I'm confident. And this, among other things, is what Martha does. And if Jesus were to come to my house this afternoon, I can almost guarantee you that I would do exactly what Martha does here in Luke. But let's step back just for 1 minute and kind of ask ourselves, what would each of us do in this situation? Jesus sends word that he's going to be in town and he wants to come to your house for a visit. What do? Well, I don't know about you guys, but we would have a family huddle and we would start handing out assignments. You've got the dusting, you've got the kitchen, you've got the vacuuming, I'll do the grocery shopping. And then we would get the inevitable question from whichever one of our kids got assigned the dusting. And the answer to that question would be, yes, you have to dust the ceiling fans. Even the parts you can't see, right? So he would arrive, come in, have a seat, let me get you something. And then I would go about and do my thing, wanting to impress my Lord, wanting to serve him with excellent work. So here's where the game gets hard to play. At some point in time, I might notice that I'm the only one in the kitchen. Everybody else is in the living room laughing and listening and having fun and having fellowship with the Lord, and this might bother me a little bit. Don't they all understand the importance of serving the Lord in an excellent way and the effort that goes into that? Why am I doing this all by myself? This is Jesus. You can't just put out cheese and crackers, right? So I might get fed up, and I might go out there and say something like, Lord, would you mind if somebody came in and helped me? I mean, I'm kind of doing this all by myself. Would that be okay? What do you think Jesus would say to that? How do you think he would respond to that? Well, we're going to read Luke here, and we're going to find out. And we're going to see how God uses this story of two women to teach what is easily one of the most powerful lessons in the Bible about fellowship and service. So let's get right into it. Luke 10, 38 through 40. Now, it came to pass as they went that he entered into a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha received him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, which also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But Martha was cumbered about much serving, and came to him and said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Bid her therefore that she help me. And Jesus answered and said unto her, Martha, Martha, thou art careful and troubled about many things, but one thing is needful, and Mary has chosen that good part, which shall not be taken away from her. Now, you may have noticed I chose the King James Version for this story, and I did it because I love this word, cumbered. It's one of those old 13th, 14th century words that we don't use anymore. I like it because it's one of the, back then they had fewer words to work with, right? So they had deeper meaning, and I love this word. It means a hindrance, an obstruction, or a distracting burden, but not one that someone puts in front of you. It's one that you put upon yourself. This particular word fits very well with the essence of our story, which we'll get to in a bit. But before we do, we have to ask the obvious question about this story. Martha was pouring her efforts into serving the Lord with excellence. Was she wrong? Well, Jesus rebuked her, so it certainly seems like she was. So the obvious follow-up question to that is our service that we do for the Lord or for others somehow or sometimes wrong? That's a tough question. Well, let's compare this situation to another involving Martha's sister, Mary. Here you'll see that Mary serves Jesus with excellence and effort. And Jesus not only doesn't rebuke her, but he defends her from criticism and praises her. So So this is from Mark chapter 14. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman, Mary, came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head, and some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want. But you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." So here at this dinner, which Martha was cooking for, by the way, Mary's service was praised rather than rebuked. I mean, if I were Martha, I would have been like, really? So why? Well, the answer to these questions can be found in the two main points that make up the essence of this story. Number one, what are the motivations behind our service? And number two, how do we respond to God's presence? So let me ask you a question. Why do we clean the tops of ceiling fan blades? Personally, I find it to be a very unpleasant job. Okay? And on top of that, no one will notice the effort that goes into it or appreciate it. I mean, none of you go to your friends' houses and check, right? I hope. Well, setting aside my personal feelings about doing it, what I would like to do is use that job as a kind of picture of the God-focused service that we engage in. Why? Because more than likely, nobody but God will see the effort that goes into that kind of service, and nobody but God will know the motivation behind it. Whether that effort and service will draw rebuke or praise from God depends entirely upon your motivation. It could be a faithful work of love that you feel led by the Spirit to do, or it could be time and effort spent in vain that could be better spent elsewhere. We all have a limited amount of resources, right? Time, energy, effort. So it would make sense that we should spend those resources in ways that are pleasing to God. We should desire the response that Mary got over the response that Martha got. So, our motivations are key. What are the motivations behind what you do or what I do? Obviously, I can't give you a definitive answer on that, but here's what I would like to suggest. If your service is an outgrowth of your fellowship with God, you can be assured that it's coming from the right place. You can be assured that it's pleasing to God. The point here is this, the point here that Jesus made to Martha. Make fellowship with God your first priority. He said, but one thing is needful, and Mary, who chose fellowship, has chosen that good part. Now, it will be convicting, fellowship with God. It will change you. It'll push you out of your comfort zone and into places, including acts of service, that you don't think you're strong enough to handle. But don't be afraid of that. Remember that God's purpose for pushing you beyond your boundaries is to get you to realize that He can and will provide for you. He said, seek the kingdom of God above all else and live righteously, and He will give you everything you need. From Matthew. Seek God first. Let Him place on your heart where, when, and how He wants you to serve. Let Him be your motivation. Remember also that when you serve others, you are in fact serving Him. From Matthew 25, Jesus said, then the King will say to those on His right, come, you who are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then these righteous ones will reply, "Lord, when did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink, or a stranger and show you hospitality, or a naked and give you clothing? When did we ever see you hungry, sick, or in prison and visit you?" And the king will say, "I tell you the truth, when you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me." So here's a tough question. I'll ask myself and I'll ask you. Have you ever served in some way and then taken that act of service and put it in your pocket like it was currency that you could pull out and use at another time? You could get credit for it in some way, or praise or recognition. I've done that. Jesus says about that, watch out. Don't do your good deeds publicly to be admired by others, or you will lose the reward from your Father in heaven. When you give to someone in need, don't do as the hypocrites do, blowing trumpets in the synagogues and streets to call attention to their acts of charity. I tell you the truth, they have received all the reward they will ever get. But when you give to someone in need, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Give your gifts in private, and your Father, who sees everything, will reward you. That second half of verse 2 has always been very convicting to me. They have received all the reward they will ever get. If we do acts of service in order to get pats on the back from each other, then those pats on the back, that's all reward. That's all we're ever going to get. Wrongly motivated service, like the service we do in order to get acknowledgement and praise from others, it's like hitting a cymbal. Everyone looks up and notices the sound, but then that sound dissipates into the wind as if it had never existed. Service motivated by love, on the other hand, and led by the Spirit, is what we should seek to pour our efforts into. The rewards for that service are eternal and will not dissipate into the wind. Remember what he said of Mary, "Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Mary's extraordinary service was an act motivated by love, pure love and devotion, which was an outgrowth of the time that she had spent at Jesus' feet in fellowship with him. That's why Mary's service was acceptable to God and drew praise from him. So that brings us to our second main point, and the reason why Martha's service drew rebuke. How do you respond to the presence of God? Well, what's important to God? Service or fellowship? Well, both. But look at what he says to Martha about Mary's choice to stay in his company. He said, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." See, God communicates to us when we're in fellowship with him. He directs our paths. He covers us and protects us. He leads us beside still waters and restores our soul. We're in God's presence, always. So how do we respond to that? Do we load ourselves down with work? Do we busy ourselves and bury ourselves in order to not have fellowship with him, to spend time with him, to read his word, to pray? Or do we recognize that fellowship is a necessary part of our time? In fact, of all the things that we could do, fellowship is what is better than anything else. Service will be an outgrowth of that fellowship, but not just random service, perfectly directed or carefully directed and perfect service. Here's the beautiful thing about this lesson. When service is motivated by love for God, born out of fellowship with him, That service is seeds that God sows through us onto fertile ground that he has prepared in advance. When you fellowship with God, he'll direct you to serve others exactly where, when, and how they need it. And it will affect their hearts in the way that he intends it to. That's how service becomes effective evangelism. The other part about fellowship is the kind that we have with each other. Martha not only neglected fellowship with God, but also with her family and friends. She secluded herself in the kitchen and buried herself in service. We're commanded not to neglect fellowship with one another, but just as importantly, we're given many biblical models about what that fellowship could and should look like. We have to be careful and vigilant about that because fellowship is a necessary part of our Christian walk, so it's naturally a prime target for Satan to attack. I think as a nation, as a Christian culture here in America, we sometimes lose sight of that. The Christian culture of fellowship in America today can sometimes be like that of a car show, where folks admire the polished fruit of each other's effort, patting each other on the back while quietly mentally checking off flaws that they might notice and whispering about those flaws to one another. Think for a moment the effect that that kind of culture can have on folks who are broken and hurting, which, if we're honest, is all of us. I was so struck a few weeks back by Wanda Croxton's testimony. I don't know if you guys were here for that, about the choice that she'd made and how that choice had rippled throughout her life and ruined relationships and filled her with shame and guilt. That shame and guilt that she felt, that wasn't from God because he'd forgiven her. But it certainly could have been exacerbated. It could have been hung around her neck like a stone by a culture that expected polish and whispered about imperfection. Instead, it was awe-inspiring to hear about the relationships that she developed here in fellowship and how those folks drew her in and provided a ministering and learning environment that eventually brought about healing. That's a story about extraordinary women courageously serving one another out of love, right here. It was awesome. It's a story about fellowship and the fruit that it can bear. See, what fellowship should look like, rather than a car show, is going to each other's garage and seeing each other's brokenness, the frustration, the hurt, the sweat and blood that comes along with running our races for Christ in a broken world. James says, therefore, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another so that you may be healed. The effective prayer of a righteous man can accomplish much. Real fellowship occurs when we're real with each other. So you might be wondering, how? When? Where do I do this? What avenues do we have here at GBC to encourage fellowship with God and with each other? Well, there's literally dozens of ways which you can find information for at our Welcome Center, but I want to focus on one that's in keeping with our theme today, and that's small groups. I would like to strongly encourage you, first and foremost, to get involved in small groups if you're not already. Small groups are the garage. This is where you'll make deep connections with people, where you can meet each other's needs and bear one another's burdens. When we first started coming to GBC, it took me years to make any kind of connections with anyone. I'm an introvert, and I have a very hard time getting to know new people. So while my wife is talking to all sorts of people, I'm just doing my best to become part of the wall, right? It wasn't until we finally started going to small groups that I actually felt like I belonged here. So if you're anything like me, if you're having a hard time connecting here, if you want to become a part of this family of believers, join a small group. The 15 minutes or so you might spend in the fellowship hall once a week having coffee and saying hi, it's not enough. Join a small group. Talk with Mark, who was on the video at the Welcome Center, or check out the church website. The bottom line is this: please do not neglect fellowship with one another. Look at the first thing that God said about us after he created us. It's not good for man to be alone. Now, we're going to kind of draw back into the story in order to answer that question from a while back. Was Martha's service wrong? Well, what a blessing to have had the opportunity to serve Jesus in her own house with excellence and effort. So that wasn't wrong until there came a point in time where she became cumbered with that service. It ceased being an act of love and worship, and it instead became a distracting task. The task became her focus, and she forgot about the fact that God was in her living room. I've done that so many times in my life, distracted myself and forgotten about God's presence. I can easily put myself into Martha's shoes. Can you? So, I have to share this funny story with you. As I was going over this talk with my family, my daughter admitted something to me. Years ago, when she had bunk beds in her room and she used to sleep on the top bunk, she would lay there in bed and reach over and draw little designs with her fingertip in the dust on top of the ceiling fan blades. So naturally, I ran right in there and I checked to see if those little designs were still there even after so many years, and thankfully they were not. But there was a lot of dust. Our service, it's necessary, and it's in fact commanded. But don't cross that line where it becomes a burden. It becomes your focus. Because that service is not what makes us worthy. Please keep that in mind if you ever come over and look at my ceiling fans.